All right, we are back, and this is We've Been New, and I'm your host, Cheyenne Doom, and this is Arc 1, Naming the Distortion. And we are 4 weeks into The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson, and today I finished it. Today was also the last day of the 100th Black History Month, and today was also the first session, which is module 1 of my foundational education towards my certification in African Black Psychology through ABPsi, the Association of Black Psychologists. Okay, that was a mouthful. Anyway, by the time this episode is over, I think you will understand why I'm telling you that it landed with the full weight of confirmation. Like, yes, you are exactly where you're supposed to be. And this is exactly the right time. Because here is what I really need you to hold as we move through these final 6 chapters. Now, the first 3 episodes of this series were Woodson building the case, documenting the architecture, showing us chapter by chapter, mechanism by mechanism, how a people were systematically kept from knowing themselves, how the professional doors were closed, how political consciousness was targeted, how the misleaders were manufactured, how this self-contempt was cultivated and installed. And that was the diagnosis. These final chapters are the prescription. And Woodson stops documenting and he starts asking, given all of that, what do we build? And his answer is not a better version of the same system. It is not reform. It is reconstruction from a completely different foundation, built on the study of the Negro, built on Black genius, built on the radicalism that rises from within rather than waiting on the outside to do what the outside was never going to do. And what I experienced today in completing Module 1 on the same day that I closed this book is the answer to the question that Woodson was asking in 1933. Somebody built it, so let's get into it. Okay, so Chapter 13 is titled Understand the Negro. And Chapter 14 is the new program. And right away, Woodson is saying something that I really want to make sure lands correctly before we move through the rest of it. So he says, the Negro has never been educated. He has merely been informed about other things which he has not been permitted to do. And I need us to sit with that distinction because it is the hinge on which this entire book turns. Being informed about things is not education. Being shown what others have accomplished and then told to go out and imitate it, that is not education. It is formation. And the question is, formation towards what? Formation toward whose ends? Woodson says that the program for the uplift of the Negro must be based on a scientific study of the Negro from within, not what others have decided about us, not what others have projected onto us, what we have thought, felt, attempted, or accomplished. Who we actually are, what we actually carry, what we are actually capable of building when the framework begins with truth instead of distortion. And he's not just talking about curriculum, he's talking about the type of people the new program needs to produce. He says, men of scholarship and consequently of prophetic insight must show us the right way and lead us into the light which shines brighter and brighter. And he is describing something very, very specific. Not administrators, not credentialed professionals oriented towards personal elevation and the comfort of the dominant class, but he's talking about people who understand that the most inviting field for discovery and invention is the Negro himself. People who are willing to build from that understanding, people with vision. And that is an institutional requirement. And Woodson knew that without institutions, vision remains aspiration. You need somewhere to put it. You need somewhere to transmit it. You need a structure that holds it across generations so that it is not dependent on any single person's lifetime. He also addresses, and I love this about him, the educators who are going to resist this. He says, education, like religion, is conservative. It makes haste slowly only and sometimes not at all. And the response to that is not to ask permission. The response is to build what is needed and stop waiting for the existing structure to become something it was never built to be. And that's exactly what happened, because 35 years after Woodson wrote this, let me tell you what happened. So, September 2nd, 1968, the American Psychological Association was holding its annual conference in San Francisco, and more than 200 Black psychologists walked out. They did not file a grievance. They did not form a committee within the existing structure and hope for incremental change. Nah, they walked out and they built the Association of Black Psychologists, known as ABPsi. And they submitted a formal petition to the APA charging that the APA had, through inadequate positive measures, condoned the white racist character of American society. They charged that the APA had failed to recognize the Black liberation movement as the most promising model for solving problems stemming from the oppressive effects of American racism. They named specifically the extremely limited number of Black psychologists, Black graduate students, Black undergraduates, and the failure of the APA to direct its scientific and professional energies towards poverty and racism. The serious lack of adequate representation of Black psychologists within the APA's organizational structure. Sound familiar? That is Woodson's Chapter 8 through Chapter 12 in action. Professional exclusion operating inside the field that is supposed to be responsible for the mental health of the community that exclusion is targeting. And these 200 psychologists looked at that and they understood exactly what it was and built their own institution. ABPsi's mission, stated in 1968 and unchanged today, is the liberation of the African mind, empowerment of the African character, and the enlivenment and illumination of the African spirit. And I want you to feel the precision of that language. Liberation of the African mind, not management, not adjustment, not helping Black people function better within a system that was designed to contain them, but liberation. And the certification in African Black psychology that I'm now pursuing is the actualization of that science in practice. It is the ABPsi saying, here is how we train people to do this work. Here is the standard. Here is what it means to be certified in African-centered psychology rather than in European behavioral framework that stripped the soul out of the discipline and called what was left modern science. And the wisdom keeper of the CAPB is Baba Wade Nobles, and that transmission carries the Jenga tradition, which is elders passing knowledge to the next generation of practitioners. And one of the things that was said in today's session that I'm still carrying is this: if the ancestors are not lost, neither are we. And that is not just a comforting phrase, that is a statement on ontological continuity. The ancestors are not lost. The knowledge is not lost. What was suppressed was not destroyed. And the institutions that people like Baba Nobles and the founders of ABPsi built part of why it wasn't. So this first module actually opened with the deep cultural structures of African peoples across the continent and the diaspora. The Dogon, the Bantu, the Congo, spelled with a K, ancient Kemet, not as anthropological curiosities, but as foundational knowledge base of the science of African Black psychology, the starting point, the ground underneath everything else. And this is what Woodson was calling for when he said Negro colleges should be offering courses in African philosophy alongside Greek philosophy, African history alongside European history, the African background from the point of view of the anthropology and history. So ABPsi did not add African knowledge as a supplement to European curriculum. They began it there. And that is the structural difference. And that changes everything downstream. And that's why I'm so excited that my particular journey has actually led me to this way of knowing. And as I think about it, with these books I have behind me that I was already planning on reading, like I was already coming to this study. And it is just so cool to me when I think about how I came into the field of psychology by way of IO, which is industrial, organizational, and consumer psychology, but I immediately knew something was missing. And once I started learning about, like, when you break down what psychology actually means and understanding that it is not the limited Western viewpoint of the study of behavior, but it is actually the study of the soul, it was like, oh my gosh, like, what I was looking for was that self-knowledge. And like it's just mind-boggling when I think about that. But anyway, I also want to get into something else that I learned. And I'm going to be kind of crossing back and forth between what I was reading and the conclusion of the miseducation of the Negro, but also what I was learning today and how it was like real time, just actually processing this knowledge that supplements itself. So what also opened module 1 today, it was the Kemetic 7 element model of the human being. And I want to go through this because I think it is essential to understanding why this new program that Woodson called for had to begin from African knowledge specifically, and not as a cultural preference, but as a scientific necessity that he spoke about. So, Ka is the physical form, the body, the grounding. Ba is the breath of life, what animates us. Kaba is emotion and motion. It's the feeling, body, the capacity for movement. Aku is thought and mental perception, the mind as an instrument of knowing. Set is the eternal soul, the part of us that is anchored beyond this lifetime. Ptah is the union of brain and the conscious mind, the seat of intentional creation. Ooh, the place where knowing becomes doing. And Atmu is the divine eternal soul, our connection to the infinite source of everything. 7 elements, a complete and integrated understanding of the human being as physical, psychological, spiritual, and cosmic, not a behavioral unit to be studied and managed, but a multi-dimensional spirit and form. And what is described here is not just what a person is, but how a person functions in harmony. All 7 elements working together, none of them disposable and none of them separable from the others. And so now think about what Western psychology did with this. It took what it could observe behaviorally, built a discipline around that, and systematically excluded the rest. The soul, though, is not a variable. Spirituality is not a clinical category. And for decades, the APA resisted even recognizing transpersonal psychology, the branch that comes closest to what this tradition has always understood as a legitimate field of study. And when it was finally accepted, it was not widely understood that transpersonal psychology is, at its root, African and Black psychology, re-entering through a door it never even needed to use. That knowledge was already there. And the root of the word psychology is not Greek in origin. It goes back actually to the Kemetic concept of Sakhu, spelled Sakhu, which means the eye of soul of being, the illumination. And what ABPsi is certifying practitioners in this full meaning of is that word, not the extracted soul-stripped behavioral management version, but the illumination. And one of the phrases from today's session that I'm not going to let go of is this: we must awaken the mother mind in us. Not a metaphor, but an instruction from within a tradition that understood long before European modernity had any interest in acknowledging it, that knowing begins in a different place than what we have been taught, that there is a depth of knowledge available to us that the dominant framework cannot access because it dismantled the tools required to get there. And then at the close of today's session, I wrote it in my notes, and it is striking to consider how much historical lies alter the self-awareness of several generations of Africans and their descendants. And this is the entire argument of this book, that just really made all of this personal. I can trace the alteration in myself. I can see the places where I was formed in imitation rather than grounded in truth. And I can also see in real time what it feels like when that starts to shift. And so let me come back to Woodson for now, specifically to what he's actually arguing in chapters 15 and 16, because this is where the economic and creative dimensions of the new program come into focus. So, chapter 15 is vocational guidance, and Woodson opens with a question that I think is even more pointed now than it was in 1933. To what are we guiding our students? He says most Negroes now employed are going down blind alleys. And he's not just talking about individual career paths, he's talking about the economic psychology that produces them. He says we spend so much time in slavish imitation, and the consequences of imitation-based economic formation is very predictable. Someone opens a restaurant on a corner and does well. So the person next door opens the same restaurant, and now neither one can survive on the divided trade. He names it in insurance companies as well. 50 companies where there should really just be one strong one. And I also see this in the nonprofit space right now, which I think I talked about last week, where organizations are doing very parallel work with no coordination, competing for the same shrinking pool of funding, neither able to build what the community actually needs because the resources are fragmented and the scarcity mindset is doing its work. And I recognize that these are not failures of character. These are actually documented outputs of a formation in imitation. You were taught to see something working and then go try to run the same play. We see this all the time in social media. But you were not taught to ask, what does this community actually need that does not yet exist? What can I build from? What can I actually carry that nobody else is going to build? And Woodson says this very, very directly. What others have done, we may not need to do. If we are to identically do the same thing from generation to generation, we wouldn't make any progress. The most inviting field for discovery and invention is the Negro itself, but he does not realize it. The Negro, with unusual insight, would write an epic of bondage and freedom that takes its place with Homer and Virgil. The Negro, a philosophic penetration, would find solace for the modern world in the soul of the Negro. And here's the part that stays with me. The door of opportunity is wide open in such a sphere, in the sphere of what only we can carry, what only we can offer. He may learn to lead the world while keeping pace with it in the development of the material things of life. And Dr. Linda James Myers, puts that framework around this. There was a really, really powerful quote. She said, "Power is the ability to define reality, and all of us have the same amount of power. What differentiates us is whether we have surrendered it to somebody else's definition of who we are and what we are capable of. And from the optimal frame of reference, we are free to pursue whatever means are necessary to bring about truth and justice, drawing on the inexhaustible self-contained energy source of which each of us is an expression." And I want to say something very personal here because it connects with what Woodson was naming about economic psychology. So I had a period of my life when I had a high income, and I still possess the material markers of that success today. And I was also a jewelry vendor at community events a couple years ago in neighborhoods that did not have that same access. And I was not being received very warmly. And I had to learn through my applied psychology coursework actually why that was happening. So there's this warmth and competence framework from another book called The Human Brand. And it talks about that when someone is perceived as cold plus competent, the emotional response is envy and the behavioral response is potential sabotage. And it said career women, highly successful people in minority communities, I inhabit both, This is actually a documented pattern where we're being seen this way and we're operating in this dynamic without even knowing it. And once I understood it, I could also trace it to family members who benefited from my income when I had it and offered nothing when I did not. And that was not individual character failure on their part, but that was actually the psychology of manufactured scarcity doing exactly what it was designed to do. The contempt for needing what someone else had, the resentment of the access. And Woodson describes this dynamic in 1933, and he calls it the fatal sort of dependency that was cultivated during enslavement and never dismantled. And then I think about the Black History Month fair that I was at this week representing Safe Black Space. And we had this game, and it's jumbo dice prompts, prompting students to name civil rights figures. And by and large, the names that were coming up were Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, sometimes Maya Angelou. Malcolm X was on the tip of tongues, and they kept not quite making it out. But one of the students, unprompted, named Abraham Lincoln as the liberation figure. And Woodson was writing about this exact narrowing in 1933. The history of Black people reduced to woe and reaction and saviorism, and the genius, the innovation, the philosophical depth, the spiritual understanding, invisible. Nearly 100 years later, the formation is still producing the same outputs. And that is definitely not a coincidence. That is a curriculum working as it was designed. Now, what I appreciate is chapter 17 is it's titled Higher Strivings in the Service of the Country. And this is where Woodson gets into politics and where I think he's actually at his sharpest. He says, the new Negro in politics must not be a politician. He must be a man. He must try to give the world something rather than extract from it. And then he says something that I really want you to sit with. He says, history shows that it does not matter who is in power or what revolutionary forces take over the government. Those who have not learned to do for themselves and have to depend solely on others never obtain any more rights or privileges in the end than they had in the beginning. And we see this. We are watching this. Black voters concentrated in Democratic Party alignment. And I think many of us already know, and the data confirms it, that alignment has not produced the structural material changes that our community truly needs. And Woodson was naming this dynamic in 1933 when he warned about friendly groups who use the race as a means to an end and drop them the moment that the utility is exhausted. He said, when the desired purpose of these so-called friendly groups will have been served, they will have no further use for the Negro and will drop them just as the Republican machine has done. And remember, in his time, Republicans and Democrats were reversed. So don't let people try to tell you otherwise. But the dynamic he is describing is identical to what we are watching now. And this is not a cynicism at all. This is actually the prerequisite for self-determined action. So Woodson says, the Negro needs to become radical. The race will never amount to anything until he does. But this radicalism should come from within, not from adopting foreign movements, not from waiting for outside forces to name the injustice or to hand us our liberation. From the specific experience, the specific knowledge, the specific genius of Black people themselves. And what I really appreciate is ABPsi was that radicalism from within. 200 psychologists walked out of the APA and said, we are not waiting for you to become what you will never be. We are building what our community needs, and they built it. And it is held for 57 years, and the certification program that lives inside it is built on the understanding that real healing, real psychology, real liberation of the African mind cannot come from the framework that starts from the wrong place. You cannot get to Saku through a system that stripped the soul out of psychology and called the remainder modern science. You have to go back to the source, and the source has been held, and the ancestors, they were not lost. And that really excites me, in case you couldn't tell. So Woodson closes the miseducation of the Negro with something that was a little sobering. He says that in his time, only 1 out of 10,000 was interested in the effort set forth what his race had thought and felt and attempted and accomplished. The vast majority had become interested in the history and status of other races, and they spent millions annually promoting that knowledge. Along with the sum, he says, should be considered that the large amount paid for devices in trying not to be Negroes. I wonder what that number looks like today. Anyway, he says, lead the Negro to believe he has accomplished nothing and thus control his thinking. If you can thereby determine what he will think, you will need not worry about what he will do. You will not have to tell him to go to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no if there is no back door, he will have one cut for his special benefit. Now, last week, the series traced how that architecture was built, but this episode has traced what gets built when people refuse it. And the number who are interested has changed. We are changing it. And that is what this series is. That is what this certification is. That is what ABPsi has been doing since 1968. The institution Woodson called for, the program that actually got built. And there are others like it. And so my session outcomes from today's Module 1, I can now describe foundational terms of African Black psychology. I can identify core components of worldview, although I had an idea of that before. I can point to real-life examples of diaspora engaging in science. I'm able to better explain what it means to be human. And those are not academic checkboxes, but those are early outputs of a program that begins with truth. We have a responsibility to know who we be. And now, here is what is ahead. The miseducation of the Negro is complete, and I'm on my path to re-education, but we are still inside Arc 1, naming the distortion. And the next two books take us somewhere Woodson was pointing toward, but did not have the language to fully reach. Next week, we begin Na'im Akbar's Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. And I already learned of Akbar because I found him on YouTube before I ever picked up this reading list. And if you have heard of him, you know that there is quality to how he explains these things that just really cuts through. Woodson showed us how the miseducated was constructed from the outside, the policy, the curriculum, the institutions. And Akbar goes inside. He names what it did to the psyche itself, the patterns it installed, the ways we were conditioned to participate in our own containment, and what it actually takes to break what was built in there, not just recognize it, but break it. And after that, we're going to actually stay with Akbar for Know Thyself. And then I've been waiting for this one since the fall. Actually, I've been waiting for this one, but also this one, Marimba Ani's Yurugu. And today I told the class the same thing that I will tell you. Once I came across Yurugu, I knew I could never go back. Well, unless it was in the Sankofa way. And this book is going to ask us to look at European cultural thought and behavior through a lens that most of us were never given access to. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And then after Yurugu, it's going to be Francis Cress Welsing's The ISIS Papers, and then Bruce Bynum's Dark Light Consciousness to close out Arc 1. So, it's pretty heavy. 6 books, 1 arc, a sustained, deliberate effort to name what was done to the mind, the soul, the worldview of African people across the globe so that we can stop operating from the distortion as though it were truth. The ancestors are not lost. Neither are we. This has been We've Been New, and we are just getting started.